Welcome to this week's Information Visualization lecture. This time we're going to be talking about data and bias. I want to focus this week a little bit on the ethics of data visualization and more generally the ethics of the data-centric world that we find ourselves living in. So in 1938, there was a radio broadcast of a play. The play was based on H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, in which Mars invades Earth. And they did it in this really interesting style. The young guy who ran the thing, Orson Welles, no relation to H.G. Wells, decided to do it as a series of radio broadcasts and key intervals during the invasion. I've actually got a couple of key minutes from that for you right now. Let's listen to it together.
Then you're quite convinced, as a scientist, that living intelligence as we know it does not exist on Mars?
I'd say the chances against it are 1,000 to 1.
And yet, how do you account for these gas eruptions occurring on the surface of the planet at regular intervals?
Phillips, I cannot account for it.
By the way, Professor, for the benefit of our listeners, how far is Mars from the Earth?
Approximately 40 million miles.
Well, that seems a safe enough distance. Just a moment, ladies and gentlemen. Someone has just handed Professor Pearson a message. While he reads it, let me remind you that we are speaking to you from the observatory in Princeton, New Jersey, where we are interviewing the world-famous astronomer, Professor Pearson. One moment, please. Professor Pearson has passed me a message which he has just received. Professor, may I read the message to the listening audience?
Certainly, Mr. Phillips.
Ladies and gentlemen, I shall read you a wire addressed to Professor Pearson from Dr. Gray of the Natural History Museum, New York. Quote, 9:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Seismograph registered shock of almost earthquake intensity occurring within a radius of 20 miles of Princeton. Please investigate. Signed, Lloyd Gray, Chief of Astronomical Division. Unquote. Professor Pearson, could this occurrence possibly have something to do with the disturbances observed on the planet Mars?
Hardly, Mr. Phillips. This is probably a meteorite of unusual size, and its arrival at this particular time is merely a coincidence. However, we shall conduct a search as soon as daylight permits.
Thank you, Professor. Ladies and gentlemen, for the past 10 minutes, we've been speaking to you from the observatory at Princeton, bringing you a special interview with Professor Pearson, noted astronomer. This is Carl Phillips speaking. We are returning you now to our New York studio.
It goes on like that for quite a while. It's about an hour in length. It is an absolutely rollicking ride. I would really suggest you check it out. But the key point here is that radio never did that back then. The idea of doing a realistic series of broadcasts as if the radio itself were, as a radio play as if it were being reported on the radio was relatively novel. And people panicked. There were actually stories of people getting guns and going to locations where the aliens had been reported to invade as if they wanted to protect the planet Earth from the oncoming Martian waves. It seems funny now, but given the history that we've had with the notion of fake news over the last, let's say, 4 to 8 years in particular, then it's interesting to reflect on how easy it is for people to believe amazing things if they're presented to them under the trappings of order, under the trappings of society. You heard reference to, this is a famous scientist from Princeton. And so people believed that. It was on the radio, so it had to be real. At about the same time, and not too far away, there was a relatively innovative research institution called the Institute for Propaganda Analysis. And the IPA's job was to understand what propaganda is and how it can be used to convince people of all sorts of different things. They produced wonderful charts like this one, radio, a tool of propagandists, and showing the number of people per radio in different countries. It's what we would now recognize as some unpleasant racial stereotypes on this one. This was 1940 after all. And the Institute for Propaganda Analysis took an interesting perspective for the time, which was that propaganda wasn't something the baddies did. It was something that everybody does. They actually have, and there's a lot of old video in this lecture, they actually have a a really fascinating propaganda techniques instructional film I wanted to share just a minute or two from.
That's what I mean. Everybody uses propaganda.
Oh, no, not everybody, Chuck. I've been studying it for some years. Propaganda made this picture. Propaganda skillfully employed to turn millions of men to a cruel hatred of their fellow men. On the other hand, propaganda often persuades us to help our fellow men. The products of our factories are also known around the world through propaganda in the form of advertising and salesmanship. The study of history reveals a great deal of propaganda that has been used to fight wars and win wars. Propaganda can also be used for peace. So you see, Chuck, propaganda is important. Well worth any time you give studying it.
I see that. But how can you study it?
Well, you can begin by investigating the techniques of propaganda. Here, I've listed some of the main ones. Glittering generalities, transfer, name calling, card stacking, testimonial, plain folks, and bandwagon. You'll find these techniques used in many places, in many ways, for many different purposes. Your job is to recognize them when you see them.
My first job is to understand what they mean.
And it's those 7 techniques that I think are such a fascinating piece of that 80-year-old instructional film about propaganda. These 7 techniques are exactly the same as what people have been talking about as hyper-partisan, fake, unreliable, misleading news and data in our world today. The medium could not have changed more from those radio broadcasts 80 years ago. But the methods have stayed the same. Because like I said in one of the other lectures on correlation, we are flawed, or maybe beautiful, or maybe both, because of our squishy meat parts and our ability to see patterns where none really are there. Glittering generalities, when you say great but vague things and it seems like someone or something is awesome. Name calling, the exact opposite, when you say he's a liar, and you don't need to provide much backup, just mentioning it is good enough. Transfer, by which they mean analogical transfer, so you transfer a positive or a negative property of one thing to another person by associating them together somehow. Card stacking, or presenting only the good parts of an argument. They mean like stacking a deck of cards by saying there's all these good and bad things, but we're just going to present some of the good or bad ones, whichever we want. Testimonials, where we do an argument from the common folks, plain folks, another one, the same sort of thing. You just find, oh, look, I don't know about all that intellectual stuff, but it doesn't seem right to me. And of course, the bandwagon effect, where you imply to someone that everybody else already believes this, so really they're the one who's left out. These are the same things that are used in elections, that are used to influence purchasing online. Anytime you get an ad that appears to be manipulating you into something, or a Facebook app that seems to be doing something a little dirty, chances are it's doing something like this. This model, the 7 different techniques of propaganda, is as old as your grandparents. What I think is a really fascinating end to this particular little anecdote is that the Institute for Propaganda Analysis was shut down in 1942 for being insufficiently patriotic. Taking a neutral, scholarly perspective on propaganda and how it could be used by any party, and these techniques were common to all of them, was considered to be communist and Nazi sympathizing in the World War II America. It appears that there are some obstacles to a better, brighter future, and they have been around for a while. Fast forward a good number of decades, and in the mid-90s, this book came out in 95, people were starting to talk about a digital transformation of society. Nick Negroponte is one of the prophets of that particular transformation. He founded MIT's Media Lab, and He wrote about how the transition from our lives being focused on atoms to our lives being focused on bits would radically reshape our society for the better. Now, Nick Negroponte predicted around when I was born, iPads, self-driving cars, the way the mobile phone would work, all of these things that we now take for granted that could not have been farther from the truth in the early 80s. And so he has a lot of weight when it comes to how these things are worked out. But he said of the way to survive in an information superhighway world that, like a force of nature, the digital age cannot be denied or stopped. It has 4 very powerful qualities that will result in its ultimate triumph: decentralizing, globalizing, harmonizing, and empowering. Well, the digital age certainly triumphed, and it was certainly decentralizing. Or was it? And it was certainly globalizing, that one. He got 100% right. Was it harmonizing? I mean, in a sense, it drove us to all be more likely to like the same things. Was it empowering? Did it give the average person more voice to shape society? The vision of someone like Negroponte is true. But at the same time, the negative vision is true as well. Does anybody remember the Facebook app? It was around 2015. This is your digital life. It was a harmless-seeming quiz app where you answered a bunch of questions. You had to say, yes, you can use my data for research. It was run by Cambridge University, and it collected a whole bunch of quiz answers on you, and then it would give you like this little personality score. I think it was one of many, many personality quizzes that were all over Facebook at the time. Well, it turns out that the people running that particular quiz, or at least the people who the data was sold to, used it for something much more like this. This is Alexander Nix, the CEO of Cambridge Analytica, the company formed out of that Facebook quiz. And they have correlation data, geographic data, breakdowns to the city block level on all of the issues that an American voter, an American citizen would be interested in. They know the correlation between ethnicity and every issue. They know the way that they have changed over time. They know the way that they change across demographics. They know that they change across age, and they change across geography. All of this was collected from those personality quizzes. It was technically not in breach of Facebook's data use agreements at the time. Although it did turn out that Cambridge Analytica had scraped this information not just from your profile after you consented, but scraped everything on all of your friends' profiles as well. That wasn't disallowed. In fact, Facebook let apps do that. You'd consented to this app recording every piece of information it could find about all of your friends. Facebook did, when it all came to light, make it impossible for new apps to do that in the future. But it was entirely their business model at the time. People consented, remember? People said that, yeah, absolutely, I don't mind this company using my data for research. I'm keen to know the answer to this little personality quiz. I want to see what kind of person I am. I'm going to get a share with my friends, get them to do it too. It was a deal that people had made, but it maybe wasn't that clear cut. Bias is complicated in the world that we're in, and data just makes it infinitely more so. When we say that someone is biased, what we mean usually is that they have an agenda. If we say a news outlet is biased, we mean that they're biased towards or against a particular political party or a particular idea. When we say a person is biased, it means that they have financial or other personal interests in a particular cause. But the word bias actually tends to just mean makes assumptions. Mathematicians and AI people talk about the bias of a model, and they don't mean the model is sexist or racist, although plenty of them certainly are, more about that later. What they mean is that the model has to make certain assumptions in order to learn anything. The model has to assume the data will fit a certain pattern to be able to see exactly the best format of that pattern. You have to make some assumptions in order to understand the world around you. And that's true of humans as well. Everything that we see is filtered through our expectations about what we're going to see, and those expectations are learned from our past experiences. It just so happens that sometimes our past experiences cause us to consciously or unconsciously have an agenda, to want to favor some things over others. And I think a good way to understand that is to go back to those 4 points I raised in an earlier lecture about how to do user research for a data visualization. Each of these is possible to be biased. There can be assumptions underlying each of these that cause you consciously or unconsciously to inject bias into what you're doing in a way that can affect people, and most importantly, a way that can have negative impacts downstream, that can have unintended consequences for either deliberate or accidental stakeholders in whatever thing you put out in the world. You have to think about your data, and I'll talk about that in the next video where we talk explicitly about data ethics. There's some really interesting ways that your audience can lead to bias. And for that, I want to go back to this guy, Alexander Nix, from Cambridge Analytica. Alexander Nix sold data to the Donald Trump for president campaign, to the Brexit campaign in the 2015 to 2017 period. That data was used to target people right down to the individual beliefs that they had about the world and to serve them targeted advertising. And it's not just about saying we think people with this combination of beliefs will like us. That's certainly a way to inject bias, but it's much more subtle than that. They took combinations of traits like gun-owning, white, doesn't have any university experience, and they showed them fake ads for black community groups in their neighborhood. They showed them fake ads for how the other side of politics was going to organize to defeat them. They made those people feel that they were in an environment where the world was against them and there was an active plot. Because, hey, look, it's showing up in my... Why is this thing about a black community group showing up in my feed? Why are they saying that they're going to take the fight to this or that they're going to march on that? Those must be shown to everybody. This is bigger than I thought. And all that comes from targeting your audience. All that comes from having not just the ability to control what information is going out, but for the ability to control precisely where that information is going to. That is modern propaganda. It's not about saying we're going to control all the information to everybody. It's about injecting a specific piece of information to one group. The context part of understanding what a visualization is for also rife for bias. This is the ImageNet database, a huge millions and millions of images, machine learning database released in 2012, where images are tagged by crowd workers. So they're tagged on Amazon Mechanical Turk. You can get money, small amounts of money, for rating particular images according to certain categories. They have tens of millions of images and hundreds of millions of tags. So the idea was, with no malice, I believe, that this would be an amazing way to create a database that could be used to train amazingly powerful machine learning algorithms, to learn about what is actually in images, because at this point in time, in 2012, deep learning was getting so powerful that people believed they could train general purpose image classifiers if they just had a labeled database of many, many images. And it's right. The existence of this database and other databases that have followed it have massively accelerated the progress of machine learning and computer vision. But these are labeled by crowd workers. And so the bias of those crowd workers creeps in. And it is depending on the context in which they were rating them, this little interface that you saw, as opposed to the context in which those tags are used. I want to show you some examples that you can pull straight out of the tag hierarchy of ImageNet. This is all work done by Kate Crawford and Trevor Paglen under the excellent project Excavating AI. You can dig into the tag sensualist, and you will find bisexual, alongside hedonist, epicure, sybarite, and cocksucker. And then, if that isn't enough, you will find inside the bisexual tag hermaphrodite and intersex. What the hell? What happened here? Well, a series of quite reasonable steps were taken, each of which injected some pretty gnarly bias into this data set. These were labeled by crowd workers. Then those labels were aligned with a database called WordNet, which has a tree structure, a graph of how all words and terms relate to each other, except WordNet is learnt from trawling the internet and then curated by people. It's not perfect. It's far from it. And nobody sits down in the depths of these hierarchies and says, as out of the millions of images, out of the millions of words, let's go and check that we don't casually insult an entire group of people just by misclassifying one word or another. I don't think that was intentional, but the amount of time that it would take to fix this is insane. Let me show you another one. This is a category that I just don't think should be there. This is a category of images tagged ball breaker or ball buster, which WordNet helpfully defines as a demanding woman who destroys men's confidence. I actually had to black out one of these images. You can guess why. This is just a bunch of women. This is just a bunch of ordinary women. Why are these tagged as ballbuster? Well, this happens to capture the bias of the people who tagged it. And because these images are then taken into a completely different context, there are algorithms out there used live by police departments, used in apps that you use everywhere in the world, powered by this ImageNet database that buried in them have some matrices of numbers that mean that that neural network associates just ordinary women with the concept of ball busting. Nobody went out to do that deliberately. Except when you think about it, it's an entirely foreseeable consequence of getting a whole bunch of people to label images and then using a database of word meanings that are curated by other people on the internet. Of course that was going to happen. And then what about that last point, purpose? Well, these lovely looking people were generated by an algorithm. This is a couple of years old now. You may well have seen these, or you've seen some of the newer stuff that's even more amazing. These are fake celebrity faces. Someone created a database of celebrities just because they happened to be, taken photos of a lot. And then you can use that to train neural networks to generate new faces from scratch, like all of these beautiful people. And that's rather the point. We're using celebrity faces, mostly Hollywood actor faces, to make algorithms able to generate pictures of new people. Can anyone see a problem that that might have as regards to the diversity of the human face? These do not represent the reality, but they are used as a stand-in for reality. They are not explicitly biased in the way that Nazi propaganda was, but they are biased. They are just a set of assumptions built on data that are buried somewhere in a system that don't quite line up with the real world. And it is always the underrepresented, the undervalued, who come out second when you round your data off and cut out a couple of the smaller factors just to make things clearer or easier or to save money or time. It just always happens that the people who aren't as visible or valued in our society get more invisible and more undervalued in our algorithms.